back there, right at the very back. Excellent, excellent. If there's some people back there still standing, you can come down and sit along the edges of the alleyways here. Just make sure there's room through. What a fantastic turnout. This is great. I was afraid with the lovely weather, everybody was going to be outside. But obviously you're as interested in the topic that will be discussed tonight as I am, so I can hardly wait. I should introduce myself. My name is Janice Dale, and I'm a member of the Department of Geology in the Faculty of Science, and I am an associate member in the Department of Geography in the Faculty of Arts. So I've got my feet in arts and science. And it is wonderful to see such a great mix of people here from the public and students. Some of my colleagues are here. And of course, we have some very special guests. And the first one, of course, is Dr. John Ralston Saul. So thank you so much for coming. This is wonderful. And I also want to mention our president, Dr. Timmins, for coming, and of course for being the instigator of all of this, I guess, with our meetings. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So there's Dr. Timmins. And somewhere spread around this room are the 14 other members of the Liberal Arts Committee, and I'll let you wave your hand if you would like to. But thank you also for coming. I'd like to just take a moment to talk a little bit about the Liberal Arts Advisory Group. We are the group that organized this lecture this evening, and again, we're so pleased to see so many people out. The group formed in the late 2013. It's an ad hoc group. It's composed of 15 members, including Dr. Timmins, who keeps us in order and chairs the meetings. We have 2 other members from the President's offices, and then we also have members from the Faculty of Arts, the Faculty of Science, the Faculty of Fine Arts, Faculty of Education. We also have members from Luther and Campion Colleges and First Nations University. So we really have very good representation of the very many communities that make up our university. And of course, typical of liberal arts itself, we are a disparate group with widely varying backgrounds, philosophies, many opinions, and areas of expertise. Where we are similar is in our interest and commitment to the value of a liberal arts education. Our mission is to discuss the challenges surrounding liberal arts, to provide ideas on how to both preserve the traditions of liberal arts and yet advance liberal arts and sciences to meet the challenges of today and into the future. So we have looked for ways in which we could promote the value of liberal arts education to as wide an audience as we possibly could. This includes our colleagues, the various faculties and colleges, our current students at the University of Regina, as well as all of our future students, their parents, and the public. And I see a large number of you out here tonight, so again, welcome. It's important to all of us to explore how to keep liberal arts strong. The University of Regina was founded as a liberal arts institution. It is the foundation of many of our own education, including my own in arts and science. We recognize that there are challenges, and we want to address them. We believe in the enduring relevance of liberal arts. For many of us, it impacts how we see and how we try to understand our world, which is becoming increasingly complex, or maybe we've made it increasingly complex. The subject areas in liberal arts are vast, and we can teach our students so much about the past, so much about the present and the future, and it can prepare them for meaningful careers and contributions to society. Now, over the last number of years, we've explored many liberal arts issues. I'm just going to name a few of them. We held meetings with guidance counselors from the Regina School Board to discuss the needs of potential students, how to encourage them to consider a liberal arts education and the value that it would be to them. And we also wanted to see what their needs would be when they arrive on campus as well. We also invited many speakers to come to our meetings to advance our own understanding of various issues surrounding liberal arts. The only one I'm going to mention here is the changing enrollment patterns that we see in liberal arts, not only at the University of Regina, but we discussed trends right across Canada and global trends as well. In addition, we've held several public events over the past couple of years, again with the idea to promote the liberal arts and to generate discussion. 2 years ago, Dr. Jack Bone, who is here this morning, so thank you. He is a professor emeritus, and Dr. Bone was here at the very beginning, and he discussed the 50th anniversary, we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Regina Beach Manifesto, which you were involved with creating, and is the beginnings of this university. Thank you. He was joined by Dr. David Helfand from the innovative Quest University, and he talked about how Quest University is re-envisioning the liberal arts education and its value to society. They were also joined by Dr. Shawneen Pete, and there you are, Shawneen, thank you for coming. And she is from the Faculty of Education. Thank you. And Dr. Pete spoke about the First Nations people, their struggles to advance their education and be heard, and the relevance of the liberal arts in this advancement. So I thank you for that. Last year, we invited Dr. Ellen Kennedy. Her talk was entitled, "The Armenians, the Holocaust, and Rwanda. Where was empathy?" She showed us the value of a liberal arts education by demonstrating how liberal arts creates greater understanding and empathy, which are needed worldwide to prevent genocide. Last month, Dr. Harvey Weingarten of the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario talked about the challenges facing liberal arts. The ideas that employers and the public have about what students are learning in universities. In many cases, they are erroneous and maybe not what we think we're teaching them. And so he challenged us to be better advocates, to clearly outline the skills in communication, problem solving, resilience that students gain through their university education. Tonight is a follow-up to Dr. Weingarten to help inspire us to advocate for liberal arts. The University of Regina President's Liberal Arts Advisory Group is pleased to present a lecture by Dr. John Ralston Saul entitled, "Learning How to Think, Learning How to Be, Reimagining the Role of the Humanities in Canadian Universities." In his lecture, Dr. Saul will explore how a liberal arts education is and can remain relevant in today's world. Now, I want to say a little bit more about Dr. Saul, and so I took the liberty of printing your CV, and it is truly impressive. You are an essayist, a novelist. He is described as one of Canada's leading public intellectuals. He was declared a prophet by Time magazine and listed in the Utne Reader's 100 Visionaries of the World. He has received many awards and prizes, 6 literary awards I counted, including Chile's Pablo Neruda Medal, South Korea's Manhae Grand Prize for Literature, and the Gutenberg Galaxy Award for Literature. He has 17 honorary doctorates, including one from St. Petersburg in Russia. He has published 14 works which have been translated into 28 languages in 37 countries. That's phenomenal. He is the former president of PEN International, which is the leading global organization of writers dedicated to the freedom of expression and literature. He is the co-founder and co-chair of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, He has received many honors: the Companion of the Order of Ontario, World Prize of Humanism in Macedonia, Chevalier des Arts et des Lettres de France. My French teacher would not be happy with me, but just to name a few. He has been inducted into the Royal Society of Canada in 2014, and he is a Companion of the Order of Canada. He also received the Tony Aspler Award of Excellence for contributions to the Ontario wine industry, which I have some questions I'd like to ask you about later. Dr. Saul has wide-ranging knowledge and expertise on everything from, and we picked out a few words here, from the humanities to the military, your PhD, and according to your website, olive oil, which is also something I'd like to discuss with you. And to think that this amazing career all started with an honors Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and History at McGill University. It's an inspiration. You are truly an amazing man. You have been described as a national treasure, and we are so honored to have you here with us tonight. So please join with me welcoming Dr. John Ralston Saul.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, now I have to...
I'm Janice's roadie.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm not dead. And the olive oil is true, actually. Adrian and I have, we spend part of our life in France, and we have a peasant farmer olive oil exploitation. We pick our own olives. Fabulous, very expensive. And very expensive to us because we always lose money, and very expensive to the consumer. But, and recently we were both inducted into the olive oil, whatever, of the south of France. So life is curious what you do. You never know what you're going to do, right? I'm just thrilled to be here, to be back here. Wonderful to see this amazing man again, and to be reminded that I gave the Luther lecture in a state beyond sanity a few years ago, where I was so tired I was holding on to the podium, I remember, as I gave it. But I do think about Regina every night when I'm in Toronto, every single night, because in our bedroom at the end of the bed on the wall facing us is the most amazing painting by David Garneau, who I think might be here, you know. And there he is. And I think, is it called Tangled Weeds? Yes, and it's a really fabulous thing that you've done, and I just, every time I look at it, I see something new in it, and everybody admires it. You know, I accepted quite fast because this invitation, because it's a good topic, and it needs to be said more and more. The fact is that there's an awful lot of talk out there about universality. And my experience with most ideas that are considered to be universal is that they're put forward by a city at the center of an empire trying to sell something. That, yes, of course, we know there are some universal things in literature, for example. It's certainly one area, and there are some breakthroughs in science that are universal, and there are some engineering principles that are universal, and so on. But values are rarely universal. It's the empires that insist on the universality of their values. And universities were really created to serve communities. Universities are a community operation. You know, in the 12th, 13th, 14th century in Europe, I mean, Bologna served Bologna, Naples served Naples, and it was very, very particular. When Vico, you know, one of the greatest philosophers, was teaching very badly in Naples, the students of Naples who paid him used to chase him through the streets, throwing things at him because he was such a bad lecturer. But, you know, we've forgiven him, and he was right. They were wrong. He was just a bad lecturer. universities belong in communities, they have a relationship with communities, and I do think that one of the glories of the particularity of Canada is that we're a country of public universities. I think that if I were to talk about the country next to us, that one of the great flaws of that country is that the thing that it thinks are its glories, its private universities, are in fact its biggest problem. That people pay fortunes to go to the Harvard law school, which is supposed to be so great. If it's so great, how come their legal system's such a mess? And I could go through a number of examples like that, their business school and so on. So, universities serve communities. They have links with each other. They have particularities which are regional, which are national, and which are international. But it's very important to realize that the fundamental role of a university is somehow to understand where they are. Who are they serving? Not just the students, but of course universities serve the whole community, whether the people are coming to the university or not. They serve people who are homeless, they serve the mayor, they serve the provincial government, they serve people who went to other places because they're living in the community. And in a sense, it's the intellectual repository of the community. It's a place where people have to know that questions can be asked and things can be discussed, which will enable the community to do better, to fix its problems, to understand itself better. And if universities turn away from that and say, oh, no, we're universal, or we're international, no, we're doing this, it has nothing to do with here, but we'll help you go somewhere else, then they're not actually really doing their job. The liberal arts, the humanities, there are probably other names for it, some of them not nice by people who aren't in this area, are what's wonderful about them and why they are the core of the university and have always been the core of the university is because it's the liberal arts, science and the arts, which are the two domains where questions are asked. They're asked all the time. It's all based on questioning. It's all based on doubt. And it's that ability to keep questioning ourselves that makes civilizations possible, makes it possible for us to fix our mistakes. And if the liberal arts are weakened, what's left in the universities does not have quite the same capacity to question itself, to question the community. And I always say to my friends who become professors, just remember, there's a big push on for you to get your PhD by writing in a language known to no human being, right? That this is wrong. This is wrong because the sole purpose of your PhD is to strengthen the community, whether it's pure science or the details of some form of literature. At the end of the day, it's about how people are going to live. And John Polanyi is, the Nobel Prize winner at the University of Toronto. John is in an area which is incomprehensible. But, he does what all great scientists do, which is he spends every minute when he's not in his incomprehensible lab explaining everything he can possibly explain to people outside. Because he knows that the job of the university is a job not of thinking, of questioning, of pushing holes in walls, and in a way of being the intellectual representative of the people in the community. And I think that the universities in this country have a very interesting role, which is only partly filled up to now, which is that this is a very peculiar country. Very, very peculiar. Very odd. This is a country which still has a language about itself which is derivative of the European intellectual tradition. And yet, I can't think of a country less European. I can't think of a country which does fewer things in reality according to the European intellectual political tradition. And I'll go through some of it as I'm talking tonight. And the oddness of Canada, which is why we haven't fallen apart, that we don't actually fit into the Western American European patterns. The oddness of Canada is something which I think is still a challenge for the universities and for the liberal arts, partly because, of course, so much of it is what we do comes out of the 14th, 15th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century in Europe. And we in some ways haven't had quite the courage to break with that past in order to address the reality of how we function here. And I'll come back to some specifics in a minute. But the most problematic thing, I mean, the reason that this committee exists, right, and that the president of the university is on this committee, which is really good, you know, it's a good sign, really it is that for the last 4 decades, let's say, the Western world has been heading down a road which is frankly problematic. And over the last decade, we've been seeing the outcomes of that problematic approach. That, you know, borders don't matter, that everywhere is the same, an economic theory which is a global theory, i.e. universal theory, therefore untrue. And with that, a curious obsession and temptation faced by utilitarianism. I mean, the rise of utilitarianism over the last 4 decades is intellectually disappointing and appalling. Because here you have civilization, Western civilization if it exists, which has never had so many well-educated people, has never known so much, has never had so much free time if we were capable of imagining how to use our time. Why at all moments in history would we choose this one to abandon the liberal arts, to abandon doubt and thinking and imagination, except for people who are paid to be professionals in that area, because it's an area of specialization, in favor of a very mediocre concept of human life, self-interest and utilitarianism? I mean, can you think of what was the point of spending a couple of 1,000 years doing all the things we've done? In 100 years, we doubled life expectancy. You know, the Roman Empire, life expectancy was, I don't know who did the numbers, was 28, unless you were a gladiator, in which case it was 29, because gladiators, the opposite of the movies, gladiators were the equivalent of hockey players, stars. It was Gretzky, you know, and so they looked after you. They wanted you to live longer. They didn't let the good ones get killed. And, but it was 28, 29, and by 1900, life expectancy in the West was 50. So we didn't even manage to double it in approximately 2,000 years. And in 100 years, we doubled it because of the liberal arts, which is to say thinking, questioning, and science. But not science alone. I mean, the engineers played an enormous role in it. Engineers sometimes forget that today, that the biggest contribution of engineering in the last 1,000 years was that in about 50 years, with doctors and with writers and with social activists, all together, as people of the world of the arts, right? Because engineers are part of the arts, they realized that, you know, clean streets, clean water, sewage disposal, a list of things added on to some new medical methods, and thanks to the if you like, the artists, the novelists, the philosophers, that, you know, different kinds of relationships of fairness in the society, that we could actually change the society. And in about 20, 30, 40 years, radical changes were made at the base of society, and one of the outcomes of that was this enormous race doubling life expectancy. I mean, you know, some particular medications help, but they didn't help as much as we think they did. Clean water, clean streets, proper sewage systems, in my opinion, and doctors washing their hands, you know, played a bigger role than the medications which most people believe were responsible for the big breakthrough. So we've, in 100 years, we doubled life expectancy. We've never had so much time to think, to question, to doubt, to imagine. And instead of that, we're so terrified by this freedom that we've allowed a bunch of mediocre people to somehow convince us that we're really just interested in ourselves, consumption, and, you know, the very basic things of life. utilitarianism, that we can't go further than that. And yet, you know, in the 1840s, 30s and 40s in Canada, the people who believed in democracy believed in public education. They didn't have the money for public education. They believed in it, and they imagined that they could do it even though they didn't have the money, right? And compare that to the last 40 years where we've allowed ourselves to be bamboozled. We've never been richer. Be bamboozled by people who told us we couldn't go into debt because debt was immoral. For governments to go into debt was immoral. As if there were any relationship between morality and debt. It was, you know, it's just technically and philosophically wrong. But, you know, so it's a very odd time, a sort of loss of direction, in which a profoundly anti-intellectual movement, utilitarianism, has been allowed to take power. And if I were to criticize us, since I've got a PhD, and even if I'm not well, I am a professor actually, sort of, but that we have not somehow done our job. And part of the attack on the liberal arts perhaps comes from the fact that that utilitarian school feels that we feel weak somehow, and that they can get us, that they can somehow find a way to limit questioning and doubt by weakening the liberal arts. The fact is that if this is an era of astonishing technological breakthroughs, which have helped to give us the kind of freedom of time that we now have, then it's clear that when you have those kind of breakthroughs, which destabilize what people are used to in their society, it's clear that if ever there's a moment for getting up every morning and looking at yourself in the mirror and looking at your family in the mirror and looking at your society in the mirror and throwing real questions around, this is the moment. If you double life expectancy, you have to ask the question, what are we going to do with the other half of my life? And because of the utilitarians who have been terrified by that and by the fact that we doubled the size of the workforce through women's rights, that they have convinced us to blow two enormous revolutions, doubling life expectancy and women's rights doubling the workforce. To blow it completely because they have convinced us that somehow the atmosphere is too fragile for us to reconsider the structures of work and the structures of education. So the result is that, you know, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, we put in place structures about when you went to school and when you left school, and then you went to whatever, and then you went to university, and when you started working, and when you retired, and of course you died shortly after that. It was all worked out so that you died really quick. You know, we're still using that system. We haven't rethought it at all. I mean, look at all the women who find themselves in astonishing careers, but the system is so arcane, the Western system is so arcane, that they are discouraged from leaving their jobs to have a child and to bring up a child. The only possible explanation for the stupidity of this argument when they're going to live to be 100 is that the people in charge are unable and terrified to use their imaginations, probably middle-aged men. But, you know, they can't actually say, well, wait a minute, we don't have to have this education and work structure anymore. We could have a different structure. And they mumble a bit about flexible work hours and things, but that's not what it's about. What it's about is actually rethinking completely the way in which individuals are going to relate to their societies, and how the volunteerism is going to work, and how citizenship is going to work, and how education is going to work. We know perfectly well that things are changing so fast that we should not be thinking about education in terms of, you know, you do it and then you leave and you go and work. We know perfectly well that probably we should be rethinking careers so that people are actually coming back into universities all the way through without necessarily losing their places and being thought to be failures because they've abandoned an ambitious career, right? So all of this thinking needs to be done now more than ever. This is one of those possibly extraordinary moments which we're sort of dribbling away. We're not making the big choices. We're not taking the big risks, which are essentially intellectual risks. A moment where you rethink the society. Every 100, 150 years, you have to rethink how the society functions because some fundamentals have changed. And really, it's frankly the liberal arts which have the obligation to be leaders in this area. And I think that is something that really just needs to be said again and again. Instead of that, we've seen, and I'll stop going on about this in a second, and talk about something a little more, I don't know, positive. But it's a little bit depressing. But you know, I remember in the 90s noting that this completely third-rate banal concept called efficiency, which is essentially a shop floor concept, right? It's a utilitarian, basic utilitarian shop floor concept, efficiency, deliverables of goods, production of goods, right? And of course we want the mail to arrive on time. We want the efficiency, but it's way down there. It's what you assume happens in a well-run society. It's not an intellectual leadership concept. And yet we've allowed ourselves to be bullied over the last 40 years increasingly by people concerned by the morality of debt and the need to abandon risk. It's interesting because they all claim they're in favor of the private sector, and they're terrified of risk. To abandon risk, rethinking things, because we have to be efficient. And we mustn't educate our kids, we must train our kids to get jobs, not to think, not to question, just to become efficient tools. And that rise of efficiency to a major role in public discussion, to me was the sign that something was deeply wrong. And it wasn't at all surprised to see that there were, not long after that started, the attacks on the liberal arts became serious. Because you can't say that efficiency is of primary importance and support the liberal arts. It's a total contradiction, right? Because one is basically the worst form of, you want employees to be efficient, and that's all there is to it. It's far, far away from what universities are meant to be doing. And now I'm going to say something which is where there's a caveat, which is, so the big growth area in the university has been business schools, right? And I'm going to say something nice about your business school. But before I do that, I'm going to say a lot of not nice things about other business schools. It's very, very odd because you've seen this explosion in business schools, which is essentially commerce degrees, which I'm in favor of. But in order to make them sound better and more powerful, they've been given all sorts of fancy names. I said this to a whole group of presidents of business schools from all over the world the other day, that they were all complaining about how the kids weren't reading the stuff and the kids weren't doing this and weren't doing that. And I said, that's because you're lying to them. They want to have a commerce degree. They just want to go into business. They're not intellectuals. Why are you bugging them? Let them do what they want. Why are you forcing them to pay all this money? Why are you kidnapping our universities, taking them off route, pretending you're doing something fabulous when all you're doing is doing a dressed up commerce degree, and causing a great deal of disorder in the role of the universities as intellectual centers, which you do not offer. And they sort of, didn't say much, really. And, if you look at it, you say, well, what have been the economic outcomes of the rise of all these business schools that are supposed to have changed our society? Has growth increased? Are we living in an era of growth? Has there been enormous innovation in business methods? I'm not talking about technology. They don't do the technology. I'm talking about business methods, new forms of capitalism, of ownership, and so on. No. What we've seen, in fact, is a sort of intellectual laziness which has led to two things, really. One is to a return of the pre-capitalist period of the large corporations like, the equivalent of the large corporations like the Hudson's Bay Company, the East India Company, which were about preventing profits from being made each time something is bought and sold, by getting a hold of a marketplace from beginning to end around the world. That's what transnational corporations do. Very large, flabby, unimaginative bureaucracies. See, that's not what people on the left normally say about them. They talk about them as evil monsters. They're just useless, boring, flabby, really odd. That's the one thing that's been the big outcome. And the second is the sort of takeover culture. And the takeover culture is what you do instead of creating something. The bigger corporations have a way of getting control over enough money and getting control over government, so they pass laws so they're allowed to take over corporations by indebting the corporation they're taking over. This is not imaginative. This is snake oil. This is not creating wealth. This is not growth. And all of that is an outcome, if you like, of the creation of the business schools. What's interesting about yours, as I understand it, is that 50% of the courses are liberal arts, which makes it a completely different proposition. Makes it actually a very interesting proposition for the kids and, frankly, for the economy. And I understand as a result of that, your school is doing incredibly well in kind of, I don't know how they're rated, but in ratings in Canada. And I mean, that shows how the liberal arts have an enormously important role to play in business. And in fact, I know that the smart people in banking and so on are looking for kids out of philosophy and history because they find the people coming out of your standard business school can't think. They don't know how to think. So they're useless if you're in the real business world. You know, they're managers. You want thinkers at the top. So let me just for the fun of it, give you a quote, a very important quote from a major figure, which sort of, I think, expresses this era that I'm describing. The past century, the 19th century, proclaimed the equality of citizens before the law, a conquest carrying formidable weight. This century, the 20th, upholds, in fact, consolidates this principle, but adds another, which is nonetheless fundamental: the equality of men before work, understood as a duty and right, as a creative joy that brightens their noble existence rather than suppresses or depresses it. It sort of summarizes the dominant theory of the last 40 years. Who said it? I know it's a trap, right? Yeah. Benito Mussolini. It could have been from any study done by any major management consultancy firm today. But they're not well educated enough to know that what they're doing is echoing corporatism and Benito Mussolini. That's what I wrote about in The Unconscious Civilization. I didn't have that quote at the time. Just such a wonderful quote. I did that once in front of an English audience, and they went completely ballistic. I mean, you're very calm in comparison. Maybe you're just nicer, I don't know, or more interesting. So, in spite of this cheap shot, by the way, I left out the phrase when I said this century upholds. It was this fascist century upholds, just so you know. But it was one word I took out. And the rise of utilitarianism has been accompanied by, as you know, an obsession with measuring. Of course, we do have to measure, but an obsession with measuring, which has infected, I think, our liberal arts also. And we are not conscious about where that's coming from, because the measuring of the liberal arts often gets in the way of the thinking. And also the idea that what we do is as good as a science, and yet no scientist believes that science works the way this measuring theory thinks it works. In other words, I hear people in some of the social sciences talk about the fact that they've got the proof, they have the facts, they have the truth. I've never heard a scientist talk that way. Because the scientists know that, every answer is just the question to the next question, looking for the next answer, which is the next question. So we have to be so careful, because this utilitarian reign is invading. It's not simply attacking, it's also invading the intellectual approaches of the humanities. And somehow we have to put our energy into pushing very hard for the idea that the humanities are about thinking and imagination and about culture, which includes measurement, but is not about certainty. It's not about the answers. And we have to remember that culture and democracy are not about certainty. Democracy is not about certainty. It's not about answers. It's about living with doubt, if it's healthy. Let me take one specific example, languages. The utilitarian school believes that English is a universal language, and that basically it's good enough to speak English. I beat this all over the place, particularly not too far away from here. And there's a whole, the more powerful people are, the more they seem to believe, well, I've got English and everybody understands English. They have no idea that when they're going to Berlin to visit their corporation or their whatevers, that of course there are special people put in charge of them who will talk to them in English and take them to the restaurants where people speak English and take them to. So they walk through Berlin in English. They have no idea that if that person went away and they were left on their own, they'd be surrounded by people who speak German. And many of them don't speak English. So it's a kind of delusional, universal idea of one language will get you through. And one of the results of that is that this is an era, I mean, there are many explanations. One of them is that this is an era where there are many, many languages which are endangered. Languages are disappearing at a speed which we haven't seen, at least for a very long time. It may be some point in the past when there was more, but certainly in recorded history, I think it's the worst that we've seen. And there are a couple of people who look knowledgeable who are nodding, so I may be okay. I'm always getting nervous at universities with my facts. And the lack of will to defend these languages is part of the utilitarianism, and it's part of the fact that social Darwinism, complete misrepresentation of Darwin, is still alive and well. Well, they must be the weak languages. I have this conversation all the time as president of Penn. I mean, people, when we're working very hard in the defense of languages, and then you're meeting all these people saying, oh, well, I mean, if they disappeared, they were meant to disappear. No, you organized their disappearance. That's why they're disappearing. You did everything you could to make sure that they would not do well. And of course, the disappearance of languages is just the most incredible loss. I mean, a language is a way into thinking. It's a way, you know, we look at this microphone and each language will see it through a different history and a different perspective and have a different way of imagining it. And when a language goes, you lose one of the ways of thinking, one of the ways of imagining. It's an incredible loss for civilization, whatever that means. And it's also, frankly, if you think about freedom of expression, one of the worst ways you can attack someone's freedom of expression is to remove their language. So, you know, if I think about it, you know, in Canada we have now, 55 to 60 languages which are from here. You know, English and French, we've done our best to make them from here, but they're not from here. We've worked on them for quite a while, for 4 centuries. And they've worked on each other. We've done a pretty good job. But really, each one of these indigenous languages that we lose, we're losing a way of understanding where we are. It's a steel door, closes forever on a way of imagining some aspect of this place. So even though I don't speak any of those languages, I personally lose a great deal when one of them disappears. And so does each one of you. Not just the indigenous person. Every one of us loses something intellectually, emotionally, creatively. We lose something. So it's not about getting a PhD, studying a language spoken by 5 people, which means you'll have a tenured career because they'll be dead and you'll be in charge, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about defending, solidifying, and expanding, not helping die. You know, it's not a palliative care movement. And so, I mean, Canada's in a terrible position because 45 or so of these languages are in danger. And at this point, we have very few mechanisms in place. Governments are spending virtually no money. The new federal government says they will. And if we lose those 45 languages, we will go down in history of this era as being one of the worst countries in the world for culture. Because we'll have overseen, a rich, upper middle class country will have overseen the disappearance of 45 languages. And that's a scandal intellectually. And I think that, you know, the universities and the liberal arts have a major obligation to work in this area. I know that and I just checked with the head of your university press, that you have a big project here at the Regina University Press to publish dictionaries and readers in all the indigenous languages, which I think is fabulous. I mean, that's the kind of thing. That's a really, really important thing to be doing. That's the kind of thing which will help to reshape how this country functions, because one creates the mechanisms which people can use to strengthen their languages and to learn the languages for those who don't speak them. It's a society-changing initiative. And so I would really encourage you, since you're doing well at it, do better I mean, I don't know, find more money, I don't know. It's really it's a major thing, and it's very exciting to know that it's happening in Saskatchewan and in the University of Regina. And I think the other linguistic area that's worth mentioning at the same time is bilingualism. You know, 40 years ago or so, there were about 10 Anglophones who spoke French in Canada. I don't know. I think I knew them all, I don't know. That was one of the reasons the country was falling apart, because it was a totally one-sided conversation. You know, the Francophones had to carry both sides of the conversation. They had to talk to themselves, they had to talk to us, and they had to explain to their citizens what we were saying. And we thought that was just fine. You know, wasn't that what they were supposed to do? They're a minority, right? And on top of that, of course, we were making it incredibly difficult for Francophones outside of Quebec to use their language at all through various laws. And what's astonishing is, and this shows you the power of public education, is that through a series of laws and proper funding, in 40 years, we've moved the needle, and 50% of the people who are bilingual in Canada are quote-unquote Anglophones. That's astonishing accomplishment for public education, for all these people wasting their money on private schools. I mean, really, when you think what public education is capable of doing, how flexible it is, how it can take on something like that, and at the same time, all sorts of things were done to create French first language school boards and schools in Saskatchewan for the Francescois and so on. And so that, you know, people in Quebec had declared those minorities dead, and guess what? They're doing pretty well. You know, and it's really, really interesting. And I think you're working in this university closely with them, and you've got a new approach towards the French language, French culture department. And this is really, really important. I mean, the one thing that I would suggest is that some of the universities are creating programs that are kind of transition programs for kids coming out of immersion schooling and sometimes French first language. So they're coming in bilingual. So that means they're already an intellectual. Right? Because one of the characteristics of an intellectual is you can speak more than one language because you're a communicator. It's tradition. It's always been. The role of the intellectual was to communicate through multiple languages and cultures. And they've already got that. They may be a little behind in some areas because they did that. So the universities have an obligation to help them in through a transition program and to really celebrate the fact that they're the ones who are going to, for one thing, keep the country together, because they're the ones who can actually deal with the two, you know, big language cultures. So it is an amazing, I think, positive story. It's an amazing success. And when I see what you're doing with your French studies in this university, the universities are taking up their role, and many of them are doing that. And it has radically changed the national conversation in Canada. People say, oh, you know, you got to, you know, the utilitarian. Say, well, what have they done to change the country? What have they done to change the national conversation? Right? Whereas the arts have shown that, you know, given a task, they can rise to the task and completely change the political relationship inside Canada. So that's just two examples, but actually here's the example, the thing which has not been done yet, which is we've now proved that you can take French and you can get millions of Anglophone Canadians living far away from large Francophone populations, speaking and working in French. You go to the political offices in Ottawa, it's filled with kids who are either Francescois or Franco-Ontarians or immersion schooling kids. It's amazing, right? That you can do all that, and you can solidify and expand small isolated minorities in French. So that means that that population, the kind of Francophone, Anglophone, bilingual population, has a knowledge which could be extremely helpful to Indigenous peoples. That if you're thinking of, this is a country of allies, that really, if I could think of two groups that need to be allied, it's that whole bilingual community allied with the Aboriginal community. Because if one group managed to do it, they had a lot of funding to do it, but I think the funding will come for the Indigenous peoples. I think they need to be talking to each other about what works and what doesn't work. I mean, everybody's different. But still, there are experiences, there are approaches, there are methods. We shouldn't be inventing all this from scratch again. And I think the universities have a major role to play. Again, that great round table of the humanities, of sitting people down together and saying, well, this is what we're trying to do. What did you guys do? And how did it work? I think that could be a really interesting initiative. So that's a couple of ideas around the humanities. And let me just go to a more basic issue, which is this true? Is really language and ideas all that important compared to, I don't know, money and administration? Which is, that is the argument today, right? You don't need to write well, you just need to administer properly. I don't know how you do that if you can't actually speak properly, but anyway, that's a whole other problem. So I just finished 6 years as the elected international president of PEN, 35,000 writers in 122 countries, organized into 155 PEN centers. The oldest civil society organization in the world, organized in 1921 by Galsworthy, H.G. Wells, Conrad, and Shaw, and it spread around the world immediately. And we're kind of the gold standard for knowing who's acting badly and who's putting people in prisons, and we keep a list with writers in prison and danger list. There are, well, let me put it to you this way. We're talking about the importance of language here. So how many CEOs are in prison today around the world? Under 10, probably. How many, how many generals are in jail? It might be 12 or 13. How many prime ministers or presidents? 5, 6? How many writers, which includes journalists? 850. 850. And how many of us do they kill every year? 200 to 250. So I'm making what you might call a little leap here. If the humanities and literature and language and intellectual questioning are so unimportant, why are they bothering to spend all that money on keeping us in prison and killing us? Actually, killing us is cheap. And that's why it's growing, because they find they don't have to do trials and people are following the trials, so they just make us disappear quickly. This tells you that what the arts and the humanities do is of a fundamental importance. And who are we being killed by? I'll tell you who we're being killed by. You think it's by Muslim extremists, right? Well, I can tell you that of the 200 killed, about 20 are killed by Muslim extremists. The rest are killed by governments who are not involved in religion, police forces, armies, large corporations, and organized crime, and the whole group working together. That's who's killing us. So, clearly there is a war going on, and it is a war between utilitarian self-interest, if you like, on the one hand, and the idea of ideas and questioning and imagining and creativity on the other. And it seems like an easy battle in Regina, but I just come back from Istanbul. I don't know if you're following at all the number of trials. I just saw Can Dündar, who's, he could be any one of you in this room. He's a very senior journalist, very senior, lovely guy, lovely family, etc. And I guess he's in his 50s. And if he's found guilty, he'll be in prison for life for having criticized the president, Erdogan, the president with whom Europe has just done a deal, right? So this is happening all over, and this is a very, very serious fight, which affects bloggers in Bangladesh, where they're hacking them to death, journalists in Brazil, where one is killed every month. That actually adds up quite fast, Mexico, Honduras, China, they tend not to kill you. They just sort of beat you up, rough you up, destroy your house. They do funny things like rip up your garden, to humiliate you. And then they put you away in jail, having held a trial on Christmas Eve so it won't be covered in the Western newspapers, It's really, really peculiar. So when people say, well, what is the role of the arts? You say, well, Voltaire, well, Tolstoy, well, Socrates. Picking all people who had difficulties of various sorts. When you start to look at language and the way language has been used through the arts, these are the guiding pillars. People don't remember takeovers of large corporations 3 weeks later. And they're still reading Socrates, X thousand years later. This is what the arts is about. This is why it's so important. And then, and I want to go back to where I began, and I'll try to wrap this up. Because, Canada is a very odd place. It's an idea of a place. Most of the interesting things we've done, like public education, Medicare, were essentially ideas argued against interests. They were, because there was not the structure, there was not the money to do any of these things, public universities and so on. We couldn't afford virtually any of the things that we've done which have made this an interesting place. And I do think that there is enormous work to be done in the humanities, in the universities, in this sense, when it comes to Canada and Regina and Saskatchewan, which is that we inherited an enormously rich tradition from Europe, and some of it is fabulous. I'm going to be the last person to criticize much of it. But we have to be very, very careful because of the peculiarity and the particularity of where we live and what we are and how we function. So I can't remember if I said it or not, but here you are in this very old civilization, after all, Aboriginals, and then 400 years with Aboriginals. Oldest continuous democratic federation in the world. First, second, or third oldest continuous democracy in the world. Very stable, very old, very experienced, yet not functioning according to any of the rules of a European American nation state. We're not a Westphalian nation state. We're not a monolithic nation state. We don't have any of the ideas of one language, one culture, one religion, one mythology, which is what the United States and European countries run on. They all run on that methodology. That's what those two world wars were about. It was the last big civil war of that European Westphalian idea of the pureness of the race of each country. Meanwhile, this funny little poverty-stricken colony out in the middle of nowhere stumbled along doing some evil things, which, I'll come to in a second, but you all know what they are, and put together something on quite a different basis, which is not monolithic, which is not Westphalian, and yet it functions. It functions. It hasn't fallen apart. It's a very interesting model, and yet we are not capable of explaining ourselves. And this is where I think the arts, the humanities in our universities have a big job to do, and it's not really done. Partly because we teach European philosophy, we teach, we're very influenced by what happens outside. And we haven't really pushed ourselves to explain ourselves, not as the best, but as peculiar, as different, as an unusual thing. And as you know, I believe very strongly that what's made this place unusual and different is that because we are geographically where we are, I just so wish I'd done geography at McGill, but anyway, rather than political science, no offense if there are political scientists in the room, but I do think geography is the key to so much. That when the Europeans started arriving in, let's say in 1600, they were lost, they were poor, they were ill-educated, they had no idea where they were, and they wouldn't have survived for 3 minutes. And for the next 250 years, they entered into a relationship with indigenous peoples, which was a relatively successful relationship, in which, frankly, the numbers are not that clear, but, there were apparently up to 2 million indigenous peoples in this area, more or less. Suppose it's off by 1 million. It's still, a very impressive number. And, the immigrants, the settlers, didn't bypass indigenous peoples until the second half of the 19th century in population numbers. So we were the tributaries, people like me, of the indigenous people. They were the people who made everything possible. It was their culture, their civilization, their way of doing things that made everything possible. We wrote home saying, "Sire, I have subjected the savages to my will." And then, of course, went outside and said, "Can you help me again?" That's the truth of our story. So it's very tough for intellectuals because the written records going back to France and England are a lie, essentially. in most cases. They don't actually tell you the truth of what happened here over those 250 years. Of course, it's 250 in the south. As you move north, it gets closer to 300, and when you get to the Arctic, the Southerners didn't really have power in the Arctic until about 1960. I mean, we were just vaguely there. And then in 1960, we did various things. And, the Inuit only had to put up with our brilliant administration for about 40 years, before they got control back again. So this incredible influence of indigenous peoples on how this place functions is something which we have not fully built into the way we think about ourselves. I know we're talking about indigenization and things are happening. There's no question things are happening. But we have to do more. We have to go faster. It has to be more important. And it is going to involve a major, major rethinking of our narrative of ourselves, because our narrative of ourselves is completely untrue. Mythology is about truth. Narrative is about truth. It has to be the reality. We're still functioning mainly on a narrative inherited from the British and the French. And, no offense to them, but we have to come up with a narrative which is not politically correct, which is not nice, and which is not, well, we have a nice course over there that you can go and take on Native peoples. We have to have something which is really a rethinking of how we all explain how we live together and how it actually works. And in many ways, it's getting both more urgent and easier, simply because indigenous peoples, having been driven from 2 million to something like 150, 175 in 1900, are now back at 1.5 million and on their way to 2 million. And they beat the pants off every government in Canada at the Supreme Court for the last 30 to 40 years. Just another great victory the other day for the Métis and the non-treaty Indians. And I think the Supreme Court has done its job. We should not be expecting the Supreme Court to do more than it's done. We have to do our job. The law is clear now. It's absolutely clear. Governments of Canada in particular, have been breaking the law of Canada for the last 30 to 40 years because they have not been obeying the instructions and the suggestions of the Supreme Court. We as intellectuals have an obligation to push very, very hard. And one of the ways of pushing is to work on changing the narrative. Fundamental change in the narrative, which means a fundamental change in what we're teaching in the departments of philosophy. The way we teach philosophy, there hasn't been an original thought in Canada for 400 years. This is not true. And we're so obsessed by that McLuhan's not in philosophy, Innes is not in philosophy. You just go through all the people who ought to be in philosophy. They have to be pushed into other departments because it's not possible that there could be original thought here. There can only be derivative thought here. We have to redo that. And, I look at, I'm a big fan, and so I say it all the time, Richard Atleo, the hereditary chief of the Ahouset, who's written 2 fantastic books of philosophy, of Ahouset worldview philosophy, which is, the second one in particular, is a major, major contribution to how we can think about life here. And, that should be being studied in the departments of philosophy. In the meantime, just read it. But it should be. We have to rethink what we need to be reading and what we need to be thinking and how we need to be doing our history. It's a joke, but, in Ottawa there's a statue of Champlain, who was actually a very interesting guy, but, clever guy, and didn't seem to be a racist. There's a big statue of him up on the banks of the Ottawa River, pointing upriver, which is, of course, the way from Quebec City, into the center of Canada. And of course, the statue he's in fabulous robes, which I'm sure he didn't have. They were so poor and so cold and so, not doing well. And he's pointing upriver saying, "That way, boys," right? That's what the statue says. Of course, what he's really saying is, where are we and where are we going? And so we have to be able to retell the story without necessarily insulting Champlain, but actually the reality of the story that it was, the Wyandots, who had chiefs who have names, who could be named, who could be in the history, who decided that they were willing to take these people to these places. That's an entire rewriting of, how British Columbia became what it is. The whole writing of British Columbia is about, the origins of British Columbia are England. right? According to the way it's described itself. Until it went from England to multiculturalism. You know? Tea in the afternoon to multiculturalism. I mean, I don't know. And completely wrote out the fact that, you know, the idea of opening up British Columbia was done by mainly Francophone Métis. That's how, you know, the rest of Canada got there. And that the whole trade routes were organized and run by Métis people. And that there were long and varied term and very interesting relationships between First Nations and ranchers. You know, the Okanagan is a fascinating area in terms of that relationship. And at the back of the comeback, I have a whole section, it's a third of the book, of letters and speeches by well-known Indigenous leaders. And one of the most wonderful, beautiful ones is from the chiefs of the interior of British Columbia to Wilfrid Laurier, who's on his fantastic, actually, trip across Canada in 1910, where he went on every branch route you could possibly take, talked to every person he could talk to. And in fact, if you like, the progressive view of what to do with Canada in the 20th century was entirely put together on that trip, because it was like a royal commission that Laurier did all by himself. The trouble was he came back and he was, you know, pretty old by then, and it was such a shock that he brought in all these things and lost the next election. We always say it was the trade deal, but it was a whole bunch of things. One of them was that he was quite interested in trying to repair relations with Indigenous peoples. Now this letter is particularly interesting because the chiefs of the Shuswap and a couple of others say they're very funny. And, you know, as all Indigenous people will tell you, if you ain't funny, you're dead, you know. And it sort of says at the beginning, you know, we welcome you here. We're so happy that you have found us in our home. It's so sarcastic. I mean, really, you know. And but then there's a wonderful moment where they say, we think we can trust you because you're a real white, which is, say, a French Canadian. Because the French Canadians came and were very respectful. And then they say, and then the other whites came, that's me, you know, the Northern Irish, you know, and broke all the rules and were horrible. And so it's a very interesting historical literary document because of how beautifully written it is and how funny it is and how tragic it is in a way. Anyway, I'm going to keep you here all night if I go on like this. But, you know, if you look at our... I just take one example. You look, and you may have heard part of this before, but let's take it in another direction. Look at our immigration citizenship policies. And of course, we've had some bad moments, what I call European moments, you know, when we did the racism number. But if you look at the line on immigration and citizenship, it's a very interesting line. And, you know, basically, you know, we've had a Department of Citizenship and Immigration in one form or another since 1867. We've had agents out around the world organizing immigration since 1867. Since 1900, we've been taking between 200 and 400,000 people a year on average. A couple of years down in the late 30s and the Second World War. For the last 40 or so years, we've been trying to take 1% of our population and we take 0.7%. And we don't have a civil war. We don't have race riots. We got problems. Of course we got problems. Everybody's got problems. And, you know, we just did this thing where we brought in 25,000 Syrians, and it was quite difficult to do because the previous government had stripped the settlement agencies and shut down a lot of the stuff we had abroad. But nevertheless, we did it in about a month, and, you know, sent 500 people, experts, civil servant experts out to Amman, Jordan, in order to work their way through choosing people. But we weren't choosing, actually the better educated people are going to Europe on those boats, the richer people. We were actually choosing, because I've gone and greeted a plane of government sponsored, they were mainly taxi drivers and farmers and butchers and things. They were choosing people so that they knew who they were. And I was quite moved because, for example, quite a few of the people who've come have come with children who are quite sick. I had Christmas dinner with one of the early families to come in because a member of our family was part of a group who'd sponsored them. And it was a boy, there was a story written about him, it was a boy who has leukemia. And obviously what the civil servants said, oh, well, that's good because we have a really good hospital in Toronto for kids with leukemia, you know, the sick kids, as opposed to saying you can't come because you're not well enough. And when they got off the plane, it was astonishing the way it was done. You just really see what a well-organized country can do. The first room they went into, it took about 10 minutes, and they got their landed immigrant papers, which meant that the clock started ticking towards citizenship. That happened within 10 minutes of getting off the plane. They were on the road to citizenship. Second room, healthcare. Third room, social insurance, so they could work and so on. And then the fourth room, which is where Adrian and I were able to talk to them all, they had little cards and they sat, and then they were called and they went into a big room, which was the old duty-free shop, and it was filled with all winter clothing. And they were, these poor people, I mean, they'd been on the road for 3 days, and they were being fitted out with winter clothing, which was really beautiful winter clothing, thank God. And people say, no, that's too tight, no, sort of thing, and they could choose colors. And it was really a wonderful thing to see. And what I'm trying to say to you is that we have this very, very long, solid experience on immigration. And how do we do this? Where does this come from? What are the roots of our approach towards immigration? There are no intellectual political roots in Europe for what we do. There aren't any. You can look, you won't find them. That's why they're in crisis today. Because European countries have been taking immigrants since the Second World War on a regular basis. They have never been able to admit that they're doing it. So they've called them, temporary workers, guest workers, refugees, whatever, migrants, that word migrants, that horrible word. Right? Keep going. You're not an immigrant. You're a migrant. And so suddenly they're in a major, major crisis because they're an immigrant continent doing actually better than they think, but they have refused to put in place the structures of immigration. Their embassies don't have, hundreds of people working on immigration. They don't have a policy. They talk about multiculturalism having failed. They've never even tried it. They don't even know what it is. They think it's just abandoning people in slums or something. So where did this idea come from? Well, I'm pretty certain that really the whole Canadian immigration citizenship policy's roots are Indigenous. They come from the way in which my family and many of your families were greeted in this country by Indigenous peoples. It's an approach. It's a non-rational, non-linear, it's non-metaphysical approach. Nobody says to you, oh, well, you were German yesterday, but today you have to change yourself 100% to become Cree. And it wasn't that. It was, well, you're here, and since we're not going to kill you, I guess we better include you. It's a circle, and we'll let you into the circle, but then we're going to have a discussion about how it's going to work and how you're going to fit in, and it's going to take a while, but it'll work out. Does that sound like Canadian immigration policy? And I think, it's really the way a non-racially based society, Indigenous societies, based on family and community and place, welcome people. And that went on for hundreds of years. And that's the basis of how we somehow instinctively used that to build the way we would welcome people. I mean, there were other little factors, but I think that's the fundamental factor. And of course, the late 90s, when there was this redoing of our intellectual history and we evacuated all memory of Indigenous contributions, right, which we still have to deal with, we're only part way, we wrote that all out. We wrote out how the Métis people came into existence, how all of this happened, how the country came into being, and instead put in place a kind of imperial colonial interpretation of who we are. So I think that that's just a single example of where there's enormous intellectual work to be done by the arts, by the universities like this, to make sure that we understand how citizenship works here and what its roots are, where it came from, what it owes to Indigenous peoples. And when you talk about the destructive effects of residential schools on Indigenous peoples and running through several generations, all of which is true. And we all say, but one of the keys to it is these kids in these schools now, these Indigenous kids, they've got to have self-confidence. They've got to feel good about themselves. They've got to, well, part of that struggle for these kids is that the narrative of the country has to be a narrative which recognizes the astonishing contribution which Indigenous people have made to all of us and to what we have. If we do that, if that shows in the narrative, the kids then have something to be proud of. You know, to be in schools with, to know that they're part of a highly successful civilization as well as a really tough civilization. And I think that if I look at that, if I look at our attitudes towards peacekeeping, our attitudes towards belonging, our attitudes towards relationships between people. I mean, you know, I've always this old joke where I say Canada is so peculiar. We have this idea of overlapping loyalties. Again, it's an indigenous idea, it's not a European idea. And we're sort of like a multiple personality order. You know, again, it's an Aboriginal, indigenous idea, the sort of circular idea of welcoming, all these things. And I think I'll just end with almost end with a quote from Northern Ontario Chief John Kelly, about 30 or 40 years ago, faced by yet another commission coming up to figure out how they could use the land. The South could use the land. And he said, you know, as the years go by, the circle of the Ojibwe gets bigger. Canadians of all colors and religions are entering that circle. You might feel that you have roots somewhere else, but in reality, you're right here with us. Now, there's thousands of letters and documents like that from Aboriginal leaders over the last 400 years. I put 12 of them in my book. I mean, there are thousands of them. And you know, one of the greatest intellectual undertakings in this country in modern time is the combination of the George Erasmus Royal Commission and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You look at the intellectual work done there, the stories that are brought out, the documents that are brought out. It's amazing. So the information is all there. Everything is known. It's no longer hidden. But what we haven't done intellectually is we haven't taken all of that and said, well, what does that mean? Of course, for Indigenous people. Of course, for the relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous people. But what does that actually mean for all of us? For who we think we are, for how we think we got here, for how we think this society works. Because there's a gigantic message in all of that work, in all of those documents, for every single person in this room. And you know, my last comment would be that you know, citizenship is not a smorgasbord. I say this in citizenship ceremonies. I mean, when you get here, you inherit everything that's here. It doesn't mean you have to agree. Doesn't mean you have to imitate, but you inherit it all. So that if you become a citizen tomorrow, you inherit our full history of anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. You inherit all the wrong that was done to Indigenous peoples. But at the same time, you're also part of that original conversation which took place here between the people who are from here and the immigrants who came here. In a sense, people like me are in the way, right? Because I've been here for a century or two. But what's really fascinating, and I think that universities have a real role to play in helping the schools, is you know, these Syrian kids, you know, they're coming from a really tough situation. Most of them haven't been in school for 3 years. You know, they've lost everything. They don't speak English or French. You know, a lot of people are frightened of Muslims, which is just nuts. You know, if there's one religion that's killed a lot of people, it's Christianity, actually. You know? Anyway, that's another subject. And I think it would be really wonderful if we started working out how we put this last group of immigrants, the Syrian immigrants, refugees, together with Indigenous people. I think that would be, in the kids in school, I think that'd be a fascinating conversation. Apparently in Saskatoon, they're in the same schools because they're living in the same areas. And I said this morning to teachers that really I think they should be organizing a really intensive thing where the kids are sitting down together talking and telling each other stories. Not just the stories of loss, but also the fun stories and the stories of their imagination. I think that they would find that they are allies of each other. I think, you know, everybody's sort of thinking, oh, are they going to get on? Is it going to be difficult? Actually, I think it's quite the opposite. I think they could be real allies because they've had suffering and they know that it can't go on. So, thank you very much. I hope this was helpful.
Just stand up on tiptoes here. Dr. Saul's very happy to entertain a few questions. So if you have some questions, I would ask you to proceed to the mics. There's one in each aisle, and then that way everyone can hear what your question is. When we finish with the question period, Dr. Saul's going to be doing a signing out in the atrium, and we have some refreshments, and we can continue the discussion. So
Yeah.
I'll open it up.
Let's not do too much, because I
No.
think you're probably tired because I went on too long. But we can also talk outside. But anyway, are there any questions? Yeah.
Just on your last part, I'd like to ask you, as a Métis person, now reclassified courtesy of the Supreme Court of Canada, and Harry the Dog Daniels, who is
Yeah.
a friend of mine,
Yeah.
what do you think of the possibility, and what would it do if the Constitution of Canada was opened up and we do away with two founding peoples and let the Indigenous nationalities self-define into the Constitution and redefine Canada as essentially the founding peoples of European and Indigenous, and what would be the impact on changing the national consciousness of the Canadian people?
Well, I think the practical answer is that it's just hell on wheels to open up the Constitution. I mean, that's the truth of the matter. And but you know, the other truth is that you know, Honduras has a beautiful constitution. You know, the most dangerous place in the world. There are lots of places with beautiful constitutions, and they're usually problematic places. We have a totally confused and incomprehensible and unreadable constitution. And maybe that's better, you know, but it has some good things in it. But the reason I'm saying this is because, to a great extent, what works in this country is not in the Constitution. It's not even in the laws. There's an awful lot of stuff which we've just worked out over the years, and we gradually formalize it some way or other. It's often formalized so long after it's become normal, it's ridiculous. You know, and so I remember when I did Reflections of a Siamese Twin, you know, and I said in it, you know, this is crazy, two founding people and multiculturalism. In reality, the country is, you know, constructed on three pillars, which Aboriginal, Francophone, Anglophone, and then there's this large skyscraper of craziness on top of it. And I thought, well, it'll be interesting to see whether people are mad like Francophones. And I found within 2 weeks, every politician I knew in Ottawa was using it. So, I mean, it's not that hard. I think that you know, now, and not only that, but it's very interesting when you listen now, people are all saying, they say Aboriginal, Francophone, Anglophone. They get the order right, you know? And I think Canadians are actually ready for all these changes. They're ready for the narrative being fixed. And I don't think they care whether it's in the Constitution, because in any case, the Supreme Court's already made it clear how the country's supposed to function. It's not ideal, but, you know.
Yeah, I know some of us are talking about this, but I won't tie it up any longer.
No, but I mean, you're absolutely right. But I mean, I think there are a whole bunch of areas where we wish we could redefine things. I think we just have to do them differently, and we have to get the intellectual language right. And if we can do that, I think the rest of it will follow. I mean, and it is some of it is really simply, we were again talking about it earlier, is simple things like renaming things. And you know, there's a street in Toronto called Davenport, which is the old major trail into Toronto, which is like all cities except Regina, I think, in Canada, a place where Indigenous peoples had been for thousands of years. So it's very stable in that sense. And, you know, I think there's a real argument for renaming Davenport, to give it an Indigenous name. But I also think, interestingly enough, you know, that we should probably get names for things like the Governor General, who's also Commander-in-Chief, and the Prime Minister, all sorts of names which are Indigenous names, and just start using them. You don't have to change the Constitution to use them. In fact, one of the letters in my book is from Joseph Brant to the then governor, and he writes, and I haven't got it in front of me, but he calls him, it's Iroquois, I guess, and it means the big knife.
Yeah.
And of course, what that means is the military leader, and so that should probably be the word we just use for the Commander-in-Chief. You don't have to change the Constitution. You don't have to change anything. You just and actually we do that all the time in quite an official way. Once people start, you know, if the Prime Minister said to the Governor General when he was supposed to be saying Commander-in-Chief said this word, the whole government would start doing it. You know, it doesn't change anything except it changes everything, because it changes the way we think about who that person is and what their responsibilities are and where they come from. Yeah. Anybody else? No? Time to drink. What? Oh, we do. Okay, yes.
The last one.
Yeah.
I only jumped up because I saw that nobody else was. And I have a debate with one of the members of the Liberal Advisory Committee, with my friend Phil over there, concerning the precedence or the central importance of the university, as opposed to other possible instances of society in generating the kind of change that you're envisioning. Right? Are these great, important changes going to stem from universities? Or maybe we're being conservative in imagining it only comes from universities. Maybe the key ideas stem from out there, and others are the ones generating the important changes. I'm thinking of big social movements. I mean, like rappers have a lot of influence. So are universities really that important?
What?
Are we going to be that important? I'd like to think we are going to remain important, but are we that important as sources of change?
Well, that's up to the universities. I mean, that's why I was making my joke about the PhDs. I mean, since I've got one, I can make a joke about it without it being accused of jealousy. That was a joke. I think that we have to really decide what we want our universities to be like. And how, that's why I was talking about the role in the community and so on. Because there's no question that if we turn away from the community and we turn inwards and we use language which is incomprehensible and so on, then the answer to your question would be it will not happen in the universities. I think the universities have a real obligation to engage. And that is the history of the universities. That's what they've done through time. And I think Canada is the kind of place where we can't afford the comfort of universities turning away from the people, which is not an anti-intellectual argument, quite the contrary. It's an argument that we must have intellectual leadership. Leadership means a relationship with. Leadership isn't, closed off from other people. And I think there are a lot of people who are in universities here and there who are doing things like that, and some of the breakthroughs are coming from inside university. But it's a real question, it's a real challenge, and of course one of the problems is that some of the funding sources don't really understand that themselves because they're very conservative. So they would like to see the universities be utilitarian. They don't really want to see the universities being troublesome with ideas, So that is a problem. But I mean, that's why we invented, tenure. I mean, tenure was invented so that professors could be outspoken. That's why it was invented. That's the purpose of tenure, is freedom of speech. There is no other purpose for tenure except freedom of speech. You can't be fired if you use your freedom of speech. That's why it's there. And we have to keep reminding ourselves of that. But we also have to remind ourselves that, one of the greatest social revolutionary movements of the last half century in Canada was Idle No More. And it came from kids who went to university, but who suddenly turned up in the middle of the winter in shopping malls and in street corners and basically said no. And I think it's triply interesting because these are kids who probably had never voted and said they didn't consider themselves Canadians because of the nation to nation and so on, and why should they consider themselves Canadians considering what was done to their families? And yet, and this is when I talk about the multiple personality order, right, and the multiple loyalties, and yet, when those omnibus bills were put forward by the last government, sneaking in all sorts of things that we still don't know what's in them, really, they're so big, but those things which were taking away some fundamental Indigenous rights, but which would also damage all of us. I mean, what was being done to fish habitats and water systems and so on. A lot of us complained, but none of us went into the streets. The only people who went into the streets to defend Canadian parliamentary democracy were young Indigenous people. Now that's really something. You see, when you talk about the narrative of Canada, I mean, that's an historic moment that we were saved because I think the beginning of the end of that government was Idle No More. I think that's when it suddenly became clear that this simply couldn't go on, that it was horrible and it was embarrassing, And that was done by young Indigenous kids. I mean, that's pretty moving, and pretty embarrassing for us, for people like me. I should have been out there in the streets. I wasn't out in the streets. I don't know how many of you were, but if you were non-Aboriginal. So, I mean, you're right. There's an obligation. We have to be ready to go out there. We have to be able to put ourselves on the line. And I see this, I've seen this for 6 years with Penn, with people going out in the streets, and sometimes it's universities, sometimes it's not. But the comfort of Canada can make us believe we don't have to do that. We do. We do have to use the universities as places of intellectual questioning and ethical rigor. So, thank you very much.
I'm going to ask Dr. Philip Sevigny, who's a colleague of mine and the Liberal Arts Committee, to thank Dr. Saul.
I'll keep it very brief. I just wanted to offer a sincere thank you on behalf of our, and I mean our in the most holistic way that you have put forth, because we are here hopefully for and in partnership with our community. We have a small token to say thank you, and I think and I hope that we can rise to the challenge and to reflect upon some of the words that you have spoken here as we embrace the peculiarity of ourselves.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I would like to thank everyone for coming out. Thank you, Dr. Saul. Thank you, Dr. Timmons, for making this possible. There is a reception and book signing outside in the atrium. We invite you to join us for more discussion. Thank you so much, and drive home safely.
Why don't we come outside? Yeah.